Paul as an alum, obviously. Before I say anything, I want to thank Christy Upson-Saya of the Religious Studies Department, who's done all the work, actually. She really, for a lot of you, there's some bad timing about this. Right shortly before Paul died, a number of people in the history department thought it would be wonderful to suggest that the college give him an honorary degree. And our timing was terrible. We found out within a few weeks that he had died. So this is our very not such a wonderful alternative, but nonetheless an opportunity to honor Paul's extraordinary accomplishments. And to start off our reception, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dean Jorge Gonzalez.
Good afternoon, everyone. And when Lynn first asked me whether I wanted to say a few words, I said absolutely yes. And the more that I heard about Paul, the more interested I was of saying a few words about him. I mean, he really is a remarkable story that really speaks about what Occidental is about. It speaks about we want to have a diverse student body, and when we say diverse student body, we mean many different diversities. And he represents one of those. And he came to Occidental, he graduated with a bachelor's in history, then went on to get a master's in history. Then from here, he went on to graduate school to the Claremont Graduate University, as it was called, or it's still called, I guess, and got a PhD in history. Then he went on to have a remarkable scholarly career. And the remarkable thing about his career is that he mixed his two passions. He was passionate about early American history, about George Washington, and he was a scholar in his own right in that field. And then welcome, please come right in. Come right in. Thrilled to have you here. The space right here in front. The ones that arrive at the end have to pay the price sitting in front.
There's room on the couch.
All right, so I was talking of Paul Longmore and saying how he had a remarkable career where he combined his passion for early American history with his passion for disabilities as a field of study. He was a pathbreaker in terms of the creation of the study of disabilities as an academic discipline, as a teaching discipline. He did that and he was very successful. And then not only that, he was not only a scholar that talked about disabilities, he was also an activist that fought for the rights of people with disabilities. And I got some information, I was reading about it, as to how at some point he was so upset with the rules that govern whether he could get disability benefits. Basically, the rules as they were written, if he went to get a job and he started to earn some money, or he published a book and he started to earn some money, they were going to take away his disability rights. So all the rules were in there to keep him in his house without having a job. And he didn't think that was right, so he fought for those rights. He actually went in front of the federal building right here in LA and he burned a copy of his book. And just to show how upset he was with what the rules were written. And as a result of his activism, actually the Longmore Amendment was passed that actually changed how you can qualify for those rights. So once again, he made a change in the life of so many people. And that's exactly what we want to do. And as I said before, as I started, this is exactly what Occidental is about. It's about providing education to a wide range of students and also giving the students the tools to change the world. And Paul changed the world. And we are very thankful that he was one of our graduates and very proud of that. And so I'm thrilled to welcome you to this reception in his honor. So, all right, please.
So everyone's standing there. Come on up. There's seats up here.
There are 4 more seats.
There's seats. There's 3 back there. There's enough for all of your bodies. So welcome everyone. I'm Christy Upson-Saya, and as Lynn said, I'm in the Religious Studies Department. I'm an historian of ancient Mediterranean religion, and I'm also the chairperson for the committee of students, faculty, and staff who put together this week of events. There's a schedule up there on the back room. If anyone wants to peruse the schedule, you're welcome to come to any of the events. So on behalf of that committee, I warmly welcome all of you, especially those outside of the Oxy community. Welcome and thank you for coming. When discussing the format for today's reception, the planning committee really just wanted to give space for us to honor the life and work of Paul Longmore. And so just to do a sort of, in my mind, I'm an ancient historian, in my mind when I think about this sort of practice, I think immediately of the Roman practice of eulogy at a funeral. That makes sense. sense, right? Eulogy, eulogia, good words or noble words that are spoken on behalf of someone. In the late Republic, Romans would, this was a part of a Roman funerary practice, they would bring their loved one, they would parade them through the city to the very center of the city in the forum, and they would actually sit up their deceased on the rostra, the stage in the forum, and then the whole family would gather behind them, including the actors who wore the masks of the ancestors to represent the entire family and the lineage of that family standing behind them. And then one member of the family, always the most rhetorically skilled male kin, would deliver a eulogy on behalf of the person. And that orator sought to articulate the virtues of that person, but then also the deep impact that that person made on the community. And his goal was to be so compelling, here's where oratory matters, to be so compelling that he moved the audience to tears. And what you have to remember is that the audience was made up not just of those people who knew that person, but also all of the people in the city who didn't know that person, but who came for the free food. And so it was a really interesting moment in which the memory of a person was promoted. And historians have long noted also that one of the functions of the eulogy was to instill and inspire the traditional Roman virtues and values as well. So this was also the moment in which virtues and values were communicated and passed along to those people who didn't even know the person. In the 2nd century BCE, historian Polybius writes, there could not easily be a more ennobling spectacle for a young man who aspires to virtue than a well-crafted and well-delivered eulogy. So here today, I hope that here today we're going to deviate a bit from that practice, and that we're going to have lots of voices, not just one, not just that male kid. And we also are going to have voices that are trying to elevate virtues and values that are not yet traditional or not yet customary in our society. But I do hope that, just as Polybius said, that our words will have the same sort of ennobling effect on those of us who are here present and those who will hear these words about Paul in years to come. So the format, we're going to start by letting Paul have the first word. We're going to watch a short video of a talk that he gave last year at the 20th anniversary of the ADA. A lot of you have seen this, I'm sure, or maybe even more present. So we're going to let him have the first word, and then our honored guest, Dr. Kathy Kudlick from UC Davis, will start us off with her tribute of Paul, and then the floor is open. So whoever would like to come up, whoever's prepared remarks or would like to say anything off the cuff, and there are some people who are reading remarks on behalf of folks who couldn't be here as well, so you two as well, come on up. And then Norm Cohen will close us down at the end. Okay, so let's let Paul speak for himself.
So Jesse asked me to talk about the history of the disability rights movement. You want to hear about your history? It's a semester-long course, so we're going to be here for a while. I ain't going to try to do it in 5 minutes. I have 3 points. First of all, we redefined the meaning of disability. That's what the disability rights movement has accomplished. The Americans with Disabilities Act was one piece of that redefinition. In fact, there was a quarter century of legislation at not only the federal but also the state level redefining what disability is, what the situation, the status of people with disabilities is, and how to address the issues of people with disabilities. And here's what the redefinition did. Previously, disability was defined as a set of limitations in the ability of people with disabilities to function in society because of some kind of pathology in us. The disability rights movement redefined disability as a problem located mainly out there in society, not just in our bodies and minds, but in society. misinterpreted it. So we had to get another law passed to redefine what the Congress intended. And we're having to fight things like budget cuts, such as Governor Schwarzenegger's unconscionable war on people with disabilities. I sometimes think Ina Shriver must be turning over in her grave. So that's the second point. We've continued our struggle to build the infrastructure of self-determination and freedom. Now here's the third point. We are the ones who did this. This wasn't handed to us. This wasn't an act of charity. This was not something done paternalistically. We made it happen. We did it. Sought to recognize our leader, Ed Roberts, with a day of significance. But here's something to keep in mind. That designated day is not just about Ed. As much as we honor him, as much as we valued his leadership, this movement was not created by one person. Great leaders do not create great movements. Great movements give rise to great leaders. So when we honor Ed Roberts, we're honoring all of us. Because no movement can exist without, in this case, millions of ordinary men and women asserting themselves to demand dignity and their rights. So that's what our movement's all about. That's our past, that's our present, that's our future. Jesse has said we're here to celebrate. We're here to celebrate what we've accomplished. We're here to celebrate what we're going to accomplish. The banners say culture, history, future. We're here to celebrate all those things. All those things that we have done together. So, let's continue to celebrate.
It's always tough to see that again. I mean, it's wonderful. It's like, you know, okay. Thank you very much for organizing this memorial, and I'm honored to be here. I'm very moved by it, and I'm very grateful to Occidental College and his colleagues here, not just for inviting me, but for really welcoming and producing such a fine scholar as Paul Longmore, as a student. And it's humbling and daunting, and of course heartbreaking to memorialize such a dear friend and a colleague and a mentor, really. But so I hope to do him justice. I'm going to read for about 20 minutes. I cleared this with the people here. And it's called An Open Letter from Paul Longmore. By the time I finally met Paul Longmore 16 years ago, I was a complete wreck. New to disability studies and awkward about my own legal blindness, I had plucked up all my courage and written him a breathless, deeply personal coming out letter. Now here I was at a Society for Disability Studies meeting 2 years later, and he hadn't answered. What was I thinking, writing to such an eminent disabled scholar and activist? Had I said too much? Been too naive? Had I inadvertently written something insensitive about disability and disabled people? Maybe I should have said people with disabilities or disabled persons. But at last, in June 1995, lurking at the back of a session in a packed, stuffy hotel conference room, I heard this clear-voiced, witty, unnervingly articulate man in the audience respond to something one of the presenters couldn't quite explain. He spoke in a paragraph commanding the attention of the room. His presence was simultaneously inviting and uncompromising, laced with, I searched for the right word because it wasn't one I often applied to academics, mischievousness. Swallowing hard, I knew it had to be him. Oh my goodness, I owe you a letter, Paul moaned, once I'd managed to squeak out my name and tried to figure out if, where, how to shake his hand, as nystagmus made my eyes jump. That's one of my conditions that makes my eyes vibrate. I can't focus. Describing himself as a, quote, hunchback in reverse and basically all buggered up to help clarify my confusion, he invited me to lunch in the hotel restaurant. I think it must have just been the two of us because I remember him unsuccessfully teaching me how to feed him. Both of us cracking up when my lack of depth perception caused me to miss my target. Remind me never to go to lunch alone with a blind person. And for reasons that say everything about Paul's way of being in the world, I felt at ease enough to tease back, next time be sure to order the piping hot soup and the spaghetti. Over the years, when people in the disability community would swap stories about how they'd met, I'd always ask Paul when he was going to respond to my letter. Not that letter again, he'd say. I'm still working on it. I have polio, and so it has to be perfect. I always wondered what he would have written as a response. At the time, I didn't know that he typed by using Hunt and Peck with a pencil in his mouth to tap the keys. I imagine him stretched out in his bed, surrounded by open books and papers, or leaning against the podium he had in his dining room table, where he'd read the New York Times and sometimes looked over one of his printouts, one moment exclaiming, "This is the best paragraph I've ever written," and the next completely tearing it apart with equal relish, saying, "Now I know what I was trying to do all along." I imagine the response to my letter flickering on his screen, interrupted by composing a long, passionate email to one of his many listserv communities. Some of those posts should be collected and published. He's the only person I ever knew to include footnotes in an email. But back to his response to my letter. Dear Kathy, and the phone rings, someone wanting his advice about how to find a lawyer specializing in disability discrimination. After an hour, he soothed the distraught mother of an autistic child and introduced her to several organizations, some related to law, others related to autism. He hangs up only to have the phone ring again. He listens to a series of excited questions, this time soothing a department colleague after a dreary meeting. Then another call, this one about an upcoming talk to a group of physicians who want the disability perspective. Do they really? He smiles, a twinkle in his eye. His evening attendant arrives to fix dinner and get him ready for bed, but she's giving 2 days' notice because she has to relocate to another state to join her partner, who finally got a decent job. How to find a new assistant, especially one who's reliable, trustworthy, and discreet. Tomorrow's lecture needs tweaking. He wants to finish watching that Greta Garbo movie he started. He wonders who, among the 3 maintenance and grounds people he's bonded with at the university, would most likely fix the broken elevator. He's almost done reading that article on linguistic theory that will help him parse out the role of language in early America. Back to the computer. Dear Kathy, dear Kathy, dear Kathy. Words begin to flow as he considers his first important principle, that people who identify as disabled must be the ones to write their own histories. And I'm going to quote a number of things, and all the quotes are from his published work, unless I say otherwise. Quote, people with disabilities and people without disabilities often perceive disability in very different ways. Indeed, many times their assumptions and perceptions radically conflict. As a result, their expectations and prescriptions about what needs to be done clash too. This seems to be a feature of the historical experience of disability throughout, at least, the modern era. Much of the time in the present, as in the past, non-disabled perspectives have dominated, while disabled views have typically been viewed as illegitimate. Disabled people have often been considered unqualified to speak for themselves, to interpret their own experience. End quote. He pauses to consider the endless numbers of books and classes about disability, most of them missing the mark precisely because they fail to take the perspective of disabled people into account. He smiles, wondering if this Kathy or most readers will appreciate his wording. Quote, "Such deficiency characterizes the academic research not only in the applied fields, but also in the social sciences and humanities. Beyond the academy, such defect impairs professional practice in a wide array of disability-related fields, including education, medicine, policymaking, psychology, social work, and vocational rehabilitation," unquote. But maybe he first needs to explain why writing such histories should matter at all. Of course, it's obvious to him, and probably to this Kathy person. She's a history professor after all. But it isn't always so obvious to his disabled brothers and sisters just trying to get by in daily life, and we saw that in the video there. He contemplates the many talks he's given over the years in to disability rights rallies, before various advocacy groups, outside of nursing homes, government buildings, impromptu gatherings, to students in his office hours and his living room. Heroes, feel-good stories aren't enough. Processes, systems, movements, individuals all need rigorous objective study, even if it means uncovering contradictions and unpleasant realities. Only through this understanding can we begin to address what's wrong and bring about lasting change. Whether it's in his speeches or the words he hopes to publish, he's on, quote, "a search for a usable past for the disability rights movement. Even the pieces that address contemporary issues must seek to locate these concerns in a larger and longer-term historical context," unquote. Then he beams triumphantly as the perfect phrase flows from his mind to the screen, quote, "The reconstruction of a usable past can contribute to the building of an accessible future," unquote. Now that he's figured out a pithy way to explain the importance of history to disabled people, he needs to find one for convincing historians why disability matters. They're a stubborn, skeptical lot, grounded in facts and archives, the real workhorses of the humanities and bearers of that creative spark. He thinks back to the joys of researching and writing his PhD dissertation that would at last morph into one of his proudest accomplishments, the invention of George Washington, published by a major university press in 1988. He recalls his double life back then. In one, he was the disability activist who fought against the cruel Catch-22 rules of the Social Security Administration that wouldn't, and still won't, allow him to accept fellowship money without cutting the benefits he needs to pay for in-home attendant care. In the other, he satisfied his insatiable hunger to understand America's colonial past, poring over documents and treatises, sparring with his professors and fellow graduate students in seminars. Quote, "Personal inclination made me a historian," he writes. "Personal encounters with public policies made me an activist," unquote. Only once he came upon Leonard Kriegel's 1962 essay, Uncle Tom and Tiny Tim, Some Reflections on the Cripple as Negro, almost 2 decades after it had appeared in the American Scholar, did he begin to see how his double life need not be double at all. He pauses to ponder burning his book about George Washington as a PR stunt to draw attention to work disincentives built into aid for disabled people. It's funny how more than anything else, this single act simultaneously underscored his double life and made it one. But how to frame disability in terms that will satisfy the curmudgeons and animate the newcomers to history as a discipline, so simple and central, yet so complex when applied to what historians think they already know. Quote, disability has functioned as a ubiquitous, though unacknowledged, organizing concept and symbol in the modern world, operating synergistically as public problem, cultural metaphor, social identity, and mechanism for managing social relations. Disability, then, is at once a neglected set of historical experiences, an important theme overlooked in many fields, and a central component of history in general, unquote. If anything is ever going to change society's attitudes toward disability and disabled people, it will have to be built on the solid foundations of historical evidence. And for historians to think of disability as important, quote, like gender, race, and class, it must become both a subject of comparative historical study and a standard, indispensable tool of historical analysis, unquote. Above all, to win converts and to remain true to his own principles, these histories have to be well done, rigorous, exacting, and ever mindful of offering real tools for bringing about change. Of course, this isn't just about history, he thinks, as he returns to the letter. There are films and television and other representations that reinforce stereotypes, feed into all the misunderstandings about physician-assisted suicide, medical decision-making, how people with disabilities make sense of a world that mostly wishes they weren't around. He sighs. The letter is already turning out to be longer than the one that requires a response. Maybe the best example of how his disability activism and historical scholarship work in tandem would be an idea that's kicking around in his head, one that he's already thinking of as the telethon book. He imagines it as a critical, deeply researched history of the most egregious exploitation of disabled people and resources. Revealing these processes and their historical roots has everything for everyone in the worlds he cares most about. Economic incentives of maintaining and nurturing disability as a multi-billion-dollar industry, politics and policy linked to a useless healthcare system, American ideas of philanthropy and doing good, conspicuous contribution. He has to write that one down. It could come in useful someday. Shameless exploitation of Jerry's kids and their families to earn money by promoting pity. The impact of mass media manipulation that trades in and perpetuates stigma. His head hurts. Plus, he's supposed to plan a second date with one of the two women he's been flirting with on email. Dr. Strangelove is on TV, or maybe a jazz concert. He closes the file and sighs. 5 years have passed. And now Paul has a real job as a full professor of history at San Francisco State University, where he's thrown himself into department and university life. And still no response to my letter, as I'm always quick to remind him. But we spent hours on the phone and occasional dinners, delivered pizza in his living room, an easy meal to serve even for someone without depth perception. He shares his excitement of getting funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities to run a summer institute for faculty interested in exploring disability studies. He will host it at San Francisco State University in July 2000 with Rosemary Garland Thompson, a professor of English then at Howard University, whose own work is also shaping the field. They will bring together 25 scholars from a variety of humanities disciplines, and he promises to write a letter in response to my application letter if I reply. I'm nervous, feeling unsure, not smart or disabled enough, my project about the history of blind people in France not relevant enough. He comforts me with an email about my proposed research, quote, "You're the one to do it. You're the only one who can. It's also important because it will enable you to explore some vitally important personal stuff. And I will support you and listen to you and give you feedback all the way. We are all embarked on on truly significant work. We are developing a usable past, and you have a key role to play. And that was an email from November 1999. I realized that encouraging someone like me isn't just about ego maintenance. It's part of a larger strategy to build a field that will change attitudes. He sees all the pieces, the scholarship and the teaching, but also the broader institutional structures that will nurture the work and sustain the message. Not surprisingly, as he's planning for the Summer Institute, he has also been thinking of other possible allies in academia, as his May 9, 2000 email to the DISHUM discussion list makes clear. Quote, "The presence of senior academicians with disabilities suggests some encouraging possibilities. Because these experienced professionals know the ropes of academic career building, they could mentor younger disabled scholars. Because of their experience in academic administration and institutional politics, some have been department chairs, deans, and occupied other administrative and leadership positions, they could play an important role in building disability studies programs. At the same time, many of them need to be mentored about a minority group perspective regarding disability. Many were taught that the way to achieve legitimacy was to overcome, in quotes, their disabilities by personal striving. They had to operate and succeed professionally within a totally unreformed system. They got little or no encouragement to name disability prejudice as their chief burden or to resist disability discrimination. Yet at varying levels," and he's going on, "yet at varying levels of awareness, they knew that they faced disability bias. The task on our side is to nurture that awareness. We need to do that not just through political advocacy, but through personal relationships. Who better than we to identify and sympathize and empathize with the struggles of other people with disabilities?" Benefiting from the 5 weeks of the lively, sustained, intense discussion at the NEH Summer Institute in 2000, our cohort of Paul's kids and Rosemary's babies gets a crash course in these lessons, one that Paul knows will carry out into our own institutional worlds. In fact, countless seeds sprout that will grow into interdisciplinary collaborations, conferences, articles, books, creative work, and even a scholarly organization, the Disability History Association. I tear up at the thought of Paul no longer being with us. Now I'll never get a response. And I won't be able to rib him about it. But as all the quotes I've included from his published work and emails reveal, he's been responding all along. Thank you.
Now, whoever wants to take the stage.
That's not fair. I'd have to go after Kathy. She is as smart and funny as Paul. Woe is me. I'm Vicki Lewis. I'm a theater professor at the University of Redlands. And for 20 years of my life, I worked at the Mark Taper Forum downtown Los Angeles, and I created plays and things about disability, as well as plays with, among others, in South Central Los Angeles, blue-collar workers, and then I went back to UCLA and ended up as a professor. And Paul was part of that work starting in 1981. He was my guide and my mentor and my colleague and my friend as we created many things together. So I have a few words about that from that perspective. But Paul, of course, made this huge impression on everybody he met, right? And so here I was in Redlands trying to find a good doctor, a good orthopedist, which anybody who has polio knows is impossible. And so there I was, and I found this guy, and
listen and he would talk. We would talk. We would have this doctor and I would talk for an hour and a half. As his colleagues were knocking on the door and we'd be talking about books and all sorts of things. And this guy's name was Christopher Job. And he is, his father is one of the great sports guys, doctors. So it turns out that Christopher Job is an alum of Occidental College. And he knew Paul. And he knew Paul as his TA in his history class when Paul was getting his master's here. And this is typical Paul. This is how Paul introduced himself to these young, athletic boys. I want you all to know I'm just not another pretty face on the that's Paul. I first met Paul at another disabled person's house in the early 80s in West Los Angeles playing Trivial Pursuit. And actually one of the things he did here, I don't know if you guys know this, but he used the you know this, that he did much of his research here in TV shows, and that he was brilliant at Trivial Pursuit. So that's how I first met Paul, was playing Trivial Pursuit. And he wiped us all out knowing everything about television. And he said it was because he was a poor little disabled kid who all he could do with his kid was watch TV. But really, he was in the archives in this very library, and that's how I knew all of this stuff. And we didn't have a chance. Of course, he used all that knowledge about mass culture to create some of this amazing, groundbreaking research and analysis that guided the movement since the late 70s. I do want you to know I was there for the book burning. And the grill belonged to Vincent Pinto. It was a Weber grill. Vince was a quad who lived in Alhambra. Wonderful playwright, wonderful humorist, and I mean, I'd have hamburgers from that grill. They had also tested out the book burning before, and so that it would work, and indeed it did work, and it was an extraordinary thing to be part of. When Paul left from Los Angeles to go to Stanford, they had to rent a hall at the beach because he had so many friends. He had touched so many people in that time. He had a series of extraordinary articles that influenced my work in theater. First was Screening Stereotypes, Images of Disabled People in Television and Motion Pictures, The Life of Randolph Bourne and the Need for a History of Disabled People, The League of the Physically Handicapped, a case study. And all of these things, many of these articles became part of plays that Paul and I collaborated on. And I guess when Kathy, that email was so moving that he wrote you. And I have to think that I did this, one of the first things I did when I got to the table, it was 1982, I came out of women's theater, and we did this play called Tell Them I'm a Mermaid. It was basically, I thought I was going to teach a class, and we were going to do scenes from the classics, and Tennessee Williams, and I got this room of disabled women, and the stories that people had to tell, it was like they couldn't wait to tell them. I was just in the right place at the right time. It was a time when none of these stories had ever been told. It was like gold. It was so fabulous. And so the play, Tell Them I'm a Mermaid, became these stories of these women with some songs. And Paul was there. And Paul said, that's the first time I've ever seen my life on stage. It's all these disabled women, But he made me think that it was really important what we were doing, that thing of nurturing. And we went on. He came in to a group of disabled writers maybe 10 years later to teach in 2 days the class he taught at Stanford on images of disabled people. We got some books. He gave us lectures. They were extraordinary. The theater where I was working, the Mark Taper Forum right downtown, they were like on their knees. They were like, could believe how wonderful he was. And many people wanted him to do a one-man show. And, you have to know, Paul, that he really could have done that. He would have been extraordinary. He was so funny and so sly and slant about everything that he was such a pleasure to be with. So we created this play called Freaks, The Hidden History of People with Disabilities, out of that workshop with him. And then in that collective collaboration of disabled writers, we tried to work with that research. He had just started to publish on Randolph Bourne. And, which if you don't know about, you got to know, and hopefully Norm will tell some more about it. And it was such an extraordinary story that we couldn't do it. We were doing comedy sketches. It was like, even though Randolph Bourne was really famous for the life of irony, this one of his essays, the Jon Stewart approach to this story just didn't work. We were being smart Alex, as Paul really was. And so it took until we had one of probably the first generation, that was the second generation after all the disabled civil rights legislation came. A young man appeared at NYU, a guy named John Beluso. He tricked the Department of Rehabilitation in Rhode Island. He told me he was studying journalism, not theater, because they wouldn't have funded him if he said he was going to do theater. And instead he got a BFA and an MFA in theater. He studied with Tony Kushner. And Tony Kushner, who wrote Angels in America, said to John, you've got to write this story. You've got to write about disability. This is the right thing. John sent me a very sweet little letter. I put him in contact with Paul Longmore. And 5 years later, a play called The Body of Bourne appeared on the stage of Marquee Reform. First time a major play had been done on disability by a really competitive, beyond sketch comedies, we've done a lot of sketch comedy, a lot of telethon scenes, and first time, a glorious piece of work. In order for the play to be done, the backstage of the table was not accessible. So anybody in a wheelchair could not perform. By that time, we had been working long enough, they could get into the theater itself, but they couldn't get in the backstage. They had to renovate the entire backstage. They had to put a bathroom on the ground stage. There were dressing rooms back there for disabled actors, of which there were 4 in the show. And all of that came about because the historian and the playwright got together. And that Paul would do that for me as a theater artist, it was really fantastic that an historian and an academic of the highest caliber would get messy with us. We're just, singers and dancers. And he came and he worked with us and we created something together. As he did with the mother who explained how to find an autism group. He did that. His generosity was unflagging. I don't know where his energy came from. Because of him, I read a lot of Bourne, and I love this one tiny quote. This is from Bourne, The Life of Irony, and where he talks about being an ironist, and I substituted for ironist, smart aleck, because I thought Paul is an ironist, but I think smart aleck really is the modern way of looking at it, the Jon Stewart way of looking at it. And so the ironist isn't an ironist. The smart aleck isn't a smart alecky because he does not care, but because he cares too much. He feels the profoundest depths of the world's great beating heart, and his playful attitude towards the grim and sordid is a necessary relief from the tension of too much caring. It is his salvation from unutterable despair. So,
I just say a word before the rest of the students leave. I'm a graduate and alum of Oxy 73, and I met Paul at church. Paul's father was a Baptist minister, and he became part of the college group of which I was a part, and your librarian Laura Serafini, her younger brother, and I lived together with Paul just down at the end of Armadale on York. I've fed Paul many times. And had the same smart-ass comments. How you're going to make it work, and but those aren't nearly as good as the comments about going to bed and getting the respirator right and all of that. It was a magnificent gift. I was one of Paul's first students. He had just finished his master's work, or was at work on the master's work, maybe, in those years. And I was right-wing Christian boy from Orange County. And I was saying things like, the war in Vietnam doesn't matter. They don't value life. And Paul Paul was saying, what on earth are you saying? And he pulled me back. And one of the most potent things he did was say to all of us, to me, you have things to learn from Noam Cohen. And I did. And it's stunning to see you here today, Noam. What a treat, what a gift and a half. I just finished a doctoral dissertation. And it all goes back to Paul Longmore and Noam Cohen and Occidental College. And I'm deeply grateful and glad to have opportunity to say a deep word of appreciation about him and my gratitude for him.
I'm going to read something from Barbara Loomis, who was a colleague of Paul at the History Department at San Francisco State University. Barbara and I were colleagues in graduate school, so that's full disclosure. We are gathered here. She said what of something she read at the time of a memorial. We are gathered here today to celebrate Paul's many achievements, but he also leaves us with a lot of unfinished business. And my purpose is to urge all of you to work with me to bring one of his projects to a successful conclusion. So this is the political action segment of today's event. As many of you know, the Social Security Act provides the necessary assistance for people with disabilities to live outside of a nursing home, but with many strings attached. One of these strings stipulates that receiving so-called unearned income ends a person's eligibility to receive Social Security. Almost exactly 23 years ago this month, Paul burned his book to bring attention to the injustice of the situation, that the $500 or so that he would receive in royalties from his book, if you want to be a historian, that's really the truth, would prohibit him from receiving the funds that paid for his personal aids and ventilator rental. His protest was successful, and the resulting Longmore Amendment now makes it possible for people with disabilities to collect royalties on their scholarly or creative work without endangering their SSI eligibility. But this campaign is not complete. Scholarships and fellowships still are considered to be unearned income, despite the fact that they often symbolize the real work that a person has done or promises to do. They are a marker of academic legitimacy and respect of one's peers. Receiving one often opens the doors to others. Success breeds more success. The denial of the right to compete for and to receive these awards is yet another instance of the ways in which people with disabilities are prevented from developing their talents fully and contributing to society. Justice demands that this practice be changed. The California Centers for Independent Living have taken on this cause to be their project. I hope that you will join the effort. For Paul, receiving the Mary E. Switzer Fellowship last summer was a wonderful acknowledgement of his lifetime commitment to teaching others about the history of the disability rights movement. Then in early August, he started to learn that he might be unable to accept the award because of the strings attached. He started to prepare for his next protest. I'm going to make some big trouble, were some of his last words to me. I'm asking that you join with Paul and me to make some big trouble. I prepared petitions to sign in which we ask that the Longmore Amendment be expanded to include scholarships and fellowships. Please feel free to take copies to get the signatures of friends and colleagues too, and mail the completed forms back to me in the History Department at SS State. There is also an online version of the petition. I hope that we can lobby together to create this change and carry on Paul's legacy. And the petition is on the table in the back of the room. You can sign it. Thanks.
I'm Alice Wexler. I'm a research scholar with the Center for the Study of Women at UCLA. And I met Paul actually more than a decade ago when we were both on a panel at the American Studies Association, I think in Orange County. and we were both talking about media representations of particular groups of people. He was talking about people with disabilities on television, and in my case I was talking about North American representations of the Cuban people during the Spanish-Cuban-American Revolution of 1898. And in both cases, we were talking about the kind of pejorative and demeaning images in which people were portrayed in terms of very negative stereotypes that were then used to justify and authorize policies that were hostile to the people being represented. So that in a sense, was my introduction to disability studies and to Paul Longmore. And I think this early contact with Paul's early work really shaped my interest in thinking about stigma and media representations of all kinds, and of the self-image that continues to this day. So over time, I actually became more involved with medical history, the history of a disease called Huntington's disease, and with the patient advocacy community of Huntington's. Huntington's, if you have never heard of it, it's a hereditary neurological and psychiatric disease. And the focus in the Huntington's advocacy community has always been finding treatments and cures. That's the mantra. And Paul's challenge, really both intellectual and social, and I think existential, to the conventional ways of thinking about the body and about dependence and independence, became really relevant to me. Because he taught me that it was possible to think even about a catastrophic disease like Huntington's from both a biomedical and a social cultural perspective. And in fact, he taught me that it was necessary to do so. To understand the disease, you had to understand the social cultural dimensions, as well as the medical and biomedical ones. And he taught me how to question what aspects of this disease actually cause suffering, because many of those aspects are not really part of the biology of the illness. And he taught me to question the whole social and cultural environments that construct our bodies and what's necessary for a good quality life, which is actually can be, I think, quite different from what we conventionally think of. So in these and lots of other ways, I still absorb the lessons that I learned from Paul, and it's really, I like to think of myself as one of Paul's children.
Yes.
An aging child.
And I teach in the history department here, and I didn't have the pleasure of knowing this extraordinary man, I'm sorry to say, although I certainly heard a lot about him from my buddy Norman Cohen. But I'm just going to read something that was sent in excuse me, by two people at UCLA who were not able to be here today. Lucy Blackmore and Helen Deutsch, who posted the following message in memory of Paul on the website for the Disability Studies minor, linked to a video of the talk that he gave in 2007 celebrating the minor's inception. And at the time they wrote, "Thank you, Paul, for your passionate leadership, intellectual guidance, and encouragement, and for coming here to help launch the Disability Studies minor at UCLA. We owe you a great debt, and you will be missed." And now, Helen Deutsch adds to that, "The message was short because our debt to Paul was so great that words couldn't really do it justice. I remember him moving an audience to tears when he spoke as one of the few male participants at a UCLA conference in 2000 called Feminism Confronts Disability. I remember how warm he was when I introduced myself to him after his talk, how he welcomed me into an emergent field with what I later learned was his characteristic generosity, energy, and openness. In person, he was an unflagging supporter of our efforts to institute the minor at UCLA, which would not have existed without his example and his advice. His work is the cornerstone of the introductory course on disability studies required for a minor. In that work's passionate vitality, its rigor, its commitment to the linked goals of historical inquiry and social justice, Paul will live on."
Hello, I'm Charlotte Fett. I'm also in the history History Department, and I also am learning for the first time this week about Paul Longmore, and it's a very good lesson. So I'm reading a statement from Robert Davidoff, is that correct? Davidoff, professor of history and Paul's graduate school advisor at Claremont Graduate University. He sent this short statement: I am sorry not to be able to be there today with you all. He's actually teaching tonight. Paul Longmore was my friend and student. We met in 1974 when I arrived at CGU and got along from the start. Paul was so bright, funny, talented, and disciplined that he was a pleasure to teach and an inspiration. His dissertation and first book on George Washington were excellent, and his essay collection, Why I Burned My Book, is a major statement of his concerns with disability history. Paul had a mission, two missions really, to use his intelligent scholarship to discover aspects of the past. He was eager to do the second volume of his Washington study, the mission to recover the past, his passionate vocation, and the one to influence the present with his research, writing, and speaking. I always knew Paul would be a fine teacher. He was a natural and so well informed that one learned from him all the time. Paul and I had many adventures in bringing his financial plight due to state rules to the public. We were on TV a lot, and Paul was a natural. He was not only a colleague and a student I respected. Paul was a good friend who was interested in me as well as my interest in him. He was a brave, sensible, talented, funny, considerate, charismatic, and good man. I still haven't accepted his death. It will take time. Paul was one of the best students I have taught in more than 35 years, and a man whose friendship I treasured. He will be missed, and I know I shall always miss him.
Remarks that were sent in by Timothy Lilly, who is fellow at the Institute for Lifespan Development and Gerontology at the University of Akron. So Timothy Lilly and his co-authors wrote this to introduce a paper at a panel that Paul was supposed to chair. That was kind of hard to follow, but I hope so this is what he wrote. Among those whom the authors of this paper would mention as being influential is a man who was to have been chair of the session and commentator on this paper, Paul Longmore. His influence in the field of disability studies and in the larger disability rights movement is extensive enough that some have called him the George Washington of the movement. So even though much of what we're going to describe in this paper occurred before Paul's eminence in the disability rights movement, it would be remiss of the authors not to make plain that his scholarship, dedication, vision, and commitment to the lives of people with disabilities, as well as to the scholarship of disability, is an important and distinguishing quality of his that should not be forgotten. At the core of his work and interest was, we think, the desire to make lives better for people with disabilities, to turn them from a faceless and forgotten minority, unless pitied, and into members of society as they are, not as our youth-oriented and perfectionist culture would have them be. I hope that others remember him in this way as well. Paul was not a friend in the usual sense of the word, but he has an influence and an important one in my continuing journey to learn about disability in ways that will be of use to people who experience it.
Well, one good thing about going this late is I don't have to explain about no, you pretty much have the picture. I was interested in that video, which I'd seen before, but this time I noticed people hollering for him to teach. And that was really cool, but it was completely unnecessary. That was his default setting, was to teach. He would type in quips and in gems and things that you would keep up on your screen forever because they were so encouraging and supportive. But he would think in paragraphs, and he would speak in PowerPoint. So when he starts to talk, it's, my first point is, and my second point, and he's not going to tell you how many points there are because there's going to be a bunch. Paul Longmore was one of the founders of the Disability History Association, and I'm the president of that right now. We could not have had the Disability History Association without Paul. Literally, he wouldn't have probably allowed us to have about him. But one of the best things about having him there, though it's significantly an academic organization, is that there was never never questioned that activism was something different. If Paul's there, they're together. They're always going to be together. And that also carried through to H Disability, which is the listserv that came out. One of the things that came out of the Summer Institute Kathy mentioned was a listserv, H Disability, for historians of disability. We have 537 members. I'm the co-editor since 2001. Those 537 members are diverse. I register each one of their memberships. I know that we have students and artists and activists. I know that we have high school teachers. I know that we have retired folks. I know that new moms come find us because they really like history and nobody else is talking about that. And I think that in some ways represents where Paul came from too. These things are together. They're all there together. But he always asked me, how many historians do we have? And I'd say, well, you know, there's this. Yeah, but what's their degree in? And I said, well, okay, I'll find out. And, are they in the history department? Okay, I'll find that out. Our very last conversation was me going through the membership rolls to figure out who had that golden combination of the history degree in the history program. So I know that you would be very glad that this event today is hosted by the history department. Thank you.
I'll be real quick. My name is Phil Ferguson. I'm a professor at Chapman University in the College of Educational Studies, where we have a disability studies doctoral program that I helped with. I knew Paul. I'll make 2 points. How about that? First of all, I met Paul, I think, in the early 90s at the Society for Disability Studies meeting. What I remember about that is I was negotiating my way in that organization. In the early days of disability studies, as well as in some ways the disability rights movement, intellectual disability, which was sort of my interest area, was not necessarily high on the agenda of topics to be studied. And so I was, yet I still felt a kinship with the approaches that in the disability studies field. So I was looking for ways to sort of make my way in. I met Paul at an SDS conference, I think at Las Vegas Casino, and which are very accessible places. He was welcoming from the start. One of the things I always found in Paul was an inclusiveness in his approach to disability studies, that he might have started from a base in physical disability, but he immediately saw all these different areas. That's something we still struggle with in disability studies, to sort of find that unity as well as the uniqueness of all the various categories of differences we apply to each other. He also was welcoming to me as this able-bodied white guy trying to sort of find his way in this organization that part of whose raison d'etre was challenging the control of able-bodied white guys, telling what disability meant. He immediately sort of saw that tension, and we joked a lot about it at the same time. My second point is that one of the things I appreciated most about Paul was what we've all heard. He was, for me, the embodiment of the public intellectual. He talked a lot about accessibility, but what he did in his activism was he made information accessible to a wider public. And that, to me, will be part of his ongoing influence.
I'm quite moved by what's taking place before me. The 60s came pretty late to Occidental College. We didn't get it very quickly. And by the time that Paul got here, there were Vietnam demonstrations, there were civil rights movements on the campus. They came slowly. The women's movement came even slower, I might add. There was a gay and lesbian group on the campus. And it became a fairly active campus. I think it was very active for its time. And well-known speakers came on the campus. Martin Luther King came in 1968. When you looked around the campus, there was pictures of the various demonstrations. There was all kinds of posters on the campus. We didn't have a place to post our pictures, but they were all over the campus on walls and everything like that. And there were a great proliferation of student demonstrations that took place. Following the Kent State killing, I'm very moved, as I said. Following the Kent State killings, the entire campus broke out. That was 1969. The Little Red Schoolhouse, that's what Occidental became, a kind of a Little Red Schoolhouse. It was a very active place. But there was no organization, there was no speakers, no awareness of or for the disabled. And we were not unique in this respect, I should add. Paul Longmore, as an undergraduate, himself an activist in the other activities that were taking place on the campus, recognized that persons with disabilities were likewise discriminated against minority, too often made invisible, despite their highly visible presence. The physical layout of the college, many of you have not been here before and you see what you see around you. Everywhere you look, Myron Hunt, the architect, had this idea of steps. He seemed to love steps wherever they went. Swan Hall, which is the building in which the history department was laid out, you can't get from one section of the building to the other. You have to go down a step, up a step, across a thing. In fact, you could never even find your way around. It really was a labyrinth to try and get around that particular building. It once had been a dormitory, by the way. The library. The library stacks were almost totally inaccessible. If you look at the old stack where many of the books that the historians have to use, you have to go through a very narrow staircase to get up and down these steps. And Paul had to go through that and face these hazards daily. He had to develop his own way of negotiating the architectural disadvantages of the campus itself. He was pretty much alone in that. But there was this group of students, and I was going to make sure that I mentioned that. They bathed him, they helped him with put his breathing tube in his neck at night, they fed him, they cared for him, and he cared for them as well. When Paul was first here, the first time I met him, his whole body was encased in metal tubes. I don't know the story of how he managed to get rid of them. Did he do that on his own?
I'm not sure.
He managed to get rid of many of the tubes that were in the campus, and he was totally, and remember, he had to walk through these, if you look at the stacks, the steps of the stacks, and you imagine him going up those steps with these tubes on, you get an idea of what it was like. Managing the physical minefield of the college was the easy part. Despite his kind acknowledgments in his writings to his professors, he thanked me, he thanked Professor Winter, he thanked Professor Kroger, but he also mentioned a professor who was the head of the department at the time, who discouraged him from going forward as become a professor. He said, nobody will ever hire anybody as crippled as you. And he writes about that in his Why I Burned This Book. We professors and some of his fellow students were also part of his problem, for the most part unwittingly, I think. With no idea of the field he was developing, I didn't understand where he was coming from. I remember in one of my classes, I mentioned that the ill-tempered Thaddeus Stevens, a radical Republican during Reconstruction, and when I talked about him, I mentioned that Thaddeus Stevens had a club foot. And I said there was a relationship between the club foot and this kind of attitude that Thaddeus Stevens had. Paul jumped up and he said, it's no use, you don't have to pick on him just because he's a cripple. and the whole class burst out laughing, and Paul laughed with them. I was humbled where he approached that. Many of you have mentioned Paul had a wicked sense of humor, and it was wicked. He loved puns, he loved jokes, he loved to laugh. And he had a way of laughing which was really contagious. He kind of would put his head to the side, if you can remember that, and he would laugh, but he also would do things with his hands. There was a way of a motion that he made. Which was kind of emphasized the laugh, and he went along with you. It was kind of a tusk at you. That's what it was. He taught me so much, I have to admit, and I taught him so little. It was he who made me read Randolph Bourne's essay. It was on my shelf. Remember how students always come into your room and say, "Did you read all these books?" I've never had, but so he made me take the book down. It probably was dusty, and made me read the essay, "The Handicap," which we referred to already. Paul took it upon himself to educate the educators, and you'll excuse myself for paraphrasing Karl Marx there. To educate the educators is what we have to do. When Paul decided to do his MA at Occidental, he asked me to be his advisor. We worked together. That system which he used was a pencil to type it out, but he had to do it on a typewriter those days. Remember, I imagine it was a little bit different than it is now. He used to take notes and everything with the pencil in his mouth and take them away. He completed his dissertation on 18th century anti-slavery movement among Quakers and Presbyterians in 1971, and then went on to the Claremont Graduate University, as we've heard, to study under Bob Davidoff. And then he went on to get his position at the History Department of San Francisco State. The day he received tenure, and you said, you reminded me that you also called me up when he got full professor. He phoned me and thanked me once again. Upon reading his fine book of essays, Why I Burnt My Book, I once more realized it was I who should have thanked him.
I want to thank everyone for coming and for the marvelous contribution you've made to making this memorial reception such a moving one. So thank you. There's still, particularly for the students still here, there are some things to eat and perhaps maybe the coffee's still hot, so you have a few minutes there. Thank you again.